Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a fascinating and honestly pretty sensitive topic today.
Okay.
The idea of the minority effect in
Hmm?
transracialism.
Right.
Have you ever thought about how minority groups,
Right.
even though they're smaller in number, can have like a huge impact on society?
Yeah.
Sometimes they even manage to shift the norms
Mm-hmm.
held by the majority, which, let's be real, in the U.S. context often means going up against the established power
Yeah.
of white males.
Yeah. That's a great point.
Yeah.
We're going to explore how that dynamic plays out when it comes to transracialism.
Okay.
Think of it as unpacking a multi-layered puzzle
Okay.
with historical pieces, scientific angles, social perspectives,
Mm.
and a whole lot of ethical and cultural questions.
It's definitely complex.
Yeah.
I mean, is it even possible to genuinely feel and identify as a race
Right.
different from your biological ancestry?
Absolutely.
That's a huge question, right?
Absolutely. And there are a lot of different viewpoints out there. But before we dive into the heart of the debate,
Okay.
maybe we should start by defining what we mean by transracialism.
Good idea.
Yeah.
So Wikipedia
Yeah.
defines transracialism as
Right.
a label used by people who identify as a different race than the one they were born into.
Right.
They may adjust their appearance to make themselves look more like that race
Uh-huh.
and may participate in activities associated with that race.
Right.
But here's the thing. The term transracial hasn't always been used this way.
Right. For a long time, it was primarily used in the context of adoption.
Okay.
You know, like when a child of one race is adopted by parents of a different race.
Like a black child being raised by a white family.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But in recent years, the term has expanded to include individuals who feel a deep connection to a race
Uh-huh.
that's different from their biological background,
Okay.
even if they weren't adopted into that culture.
Exactly.
And that's where things get a bit more controversial.
All right.
Some people, especially transracial adoptees, argue that this newer usage of the term erases their unique experiences.
I can see how that could be a concern.
Yeah.
I read this thesis on transracialism by a trans Japanese woman,
Okay.
where the author argues that both uses of the term are valid
Right.
and that recognizing transracial identity doesn't diminish the experiences of transracial adoptees.
Okay.
It's a really interesting perspective.
It is, and it highlights the need for sensitivity and respect in these conversations
Yeah.
when we're talking about race and identity,
Right.
especially in a society with a history like ours.
Yeah,
It's crucial to approach these topics with nuance and understanding.
for sure. And speaking of history,
Okay.
the desire to modify one's appearance,
Mhm.
especially in relation to race, is nothing new.
Right.
The RCTA,
Hmm.
Understanding RCTA source,
Hmm.
mentions how African Americans have historically used skin lightening products,
Right?
which shows how societal pressures and inequalities can influence individual choices.
That's an important point. It reminds us that the desire to fit in or even just survive within a certain social structure can be a powerful motivator.
Absolutely. And nowadays,
Okay.
with the rise of social media and online communities,
Mm-hmm.
the conversation around transracialism is taking on a whole new dimension.
Right.
Platforms like Reddit and Discord are giving individuals spaces
Right.
to connect and explore their identities in ways that might not have been possible before.
Yeah, you see this in communities like the Black to White Transracial subreddit
No.
and even a small Discord server specifically dedicated to discussing transracialism.
Oh, wow.
These online spaces are facilitating conversations and support networks for people who might feel isolated or misunderstood in their experiences.
It's interesting how the internet can both amplify existing societal pressures
Great.
and provide a platform for challenging them.
Exactly.
I mean, look at Ollie London, the In Defense of Transracialism, RCTA. Source mentions them.
Okay.
They spent a ton of money on plastic surgery to resemble a K-pop idol. It's a pretty extreme example of someone going to great lengths to align their appearance with their desired racial identity.
It really raises the question,
Yeah.
how far are people willing to go to embody the race they identify with?
It's a good question.
And that leads us to a crucial question.
Okay.
What does science have to say about all of this?
Right, because we're talking about race,
Right.
and there's a whole biological aspect to consider.
Yeah.
I mean, is race just a social construct?
Right.
Or is there something more to it?
According to the Wikipedia article on race, human categorization,
Okay.
the scientific consensus is that race is, in fact, primarily a social construct.
So it's all just in our heads.
It's not quite that simple.
Okay.
Geneticist David Reich makes a crucial point in that same article.
Yeah.
He says that while race might be socially constructed,
Ah.
differences in genetic ancestry that often correlate with these racial categories are very real. It's a
Okay.
nuanced point,
Yeah.
but it highlights the complex interplay between biology and social factors.
So we have this tension,
Yes.
race as a social construct,
Uh-huh.
but with real biological implications.
Right.
It's a lot to wrap our heads around.
It is, and to complicate things even further,
Okay.
we have to consider the historical context.
Yeah.
The What is Race? Biology and Social Construction source talks about how throughout history,
Right.
scientific ideas about race have been used to justify racism and discrimination.
Yeah. It's a reminder that scientific knowledge can be twisted and used for harmful purposes.
Right.
And even today,
Uh-huh.
while we can use modern medical genetics to understand nuances in how our genes relate to certain health conditions, we have to be extremely careful about how we apply that knowledge.
Absolutely, because race is about so much more than just biology. It's
Yeah.
about shared histories, cultural experiences,
Right.
and how society perceives and treats individuals based on their perceived racial category.
Right.
We can't separate the biological from the social when we're talking about race.
And for transracial individuals, this entanglement of biology and social perception becomes even more complex.
Yeah.
They often speak about feeling a deep emotional and psychological connection to a particular race,
Uh-huh.
even if it's different from their biological ancestry.
You see this reflected in personal stories shared in places like a thesis on transracialism by a trans-Japanese woman and the dire racial community of Reddit.
Okay.
Individuals describe feeling like they don't fit in with their assigned race,
Yeah.
longing for a sense of belonging,
Yeah.
and even experiencing distress because they're not perceived as the race they identify with.
There's one anecdote from the biracial community of Reddit that really stuck with me.
Okay.
A person talks about being drawn to Japanese culture from a very young age, feeling a strong connection to Japanese people,
Right.
and finding comfort in things like Japanese makeup styles.
Right.
It's a really personal example of how racial identification can be deeply intertwined with self-expression and a search for identity.
And in the transracialism Discord server, yeah,
There are conversations about finding peace and comfort in embodying their transracial identity.
wow.
It goes beyond just aesthetics or superficial imitation.
Uh-huh.
There's a real emotional depth to their experiences.
It makes you wonder about the psychological and sociological factors at play.
Yeah.
What role does cultural exposure play in shaping these feelings of connection?
Right. And how does the desire for belonging,
Okay.
coupled with the internal conflict between societal expectations and personal identity,
Uh-huh.
impact the way people navigate their racial identities?
This all gets even more complicated when you consider that, unlike gender transition, there aren't widely accepted procedures or social pathways for racial transition.
Right.
The transracial identity Wikipedia entry highlights how this lack of structure can leave individuals feeling lost and uncertain about how to navigate their journeys.
And the lack of clear pathways makes it even harder for people to find support and validation for their experiences.
Right. The https.transreads.org WP-content uploads 20.1030.3.019.03 319.03-130 CBF 571 Ragers, Brubaker Transgender and Race in an Age of Unsettled Identities -1.pdf. Source makes a comparison to gender transition, which, while not without its own challenges,
Right.
has more established medical and social pathways to illustrate this point.
So we've explored the evolving definition of transracialism,
Yeah.
looked at historical and societal influences, and even touched on the scientific and sociological perspectives on race.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
But the real meat of the discussion lies in the ethical and cultural dimensions of transracialism.
Okay.
That's where the debate heats up.
Exactly. Because now we have to ask ourselves,
Right.
can you actually change your race?
Yeah.
And if so, what are the implications?
Right.
Stay tuned for part 2,
Okay.
where we'll tackle these crucial questions head on.
Sounds good. Welcome back to our deep dive into transracialism.
Yeah. Things get even more complex as we start to navigate the ethical and cultural considerations.
Yeah.
You're telling me we've already covered so much ground,
Yeah.
and now we're getting to the heart of the controversy.
Right.
Can someone actually change their race?
Right.
It's a question that really makes you think about identity,
Yeah.
belonging, and what it means to be part of a particular racial group.
And there are strong opinions on all sides.
Yeah.
Some people argue that self-identification should be the most important factor.
Yeah.
They believe that if someone deeply feels like they belong to a specific race,
Uh-huh.
their lived experience should be respected.
I can see where they're coming from.
Yeah,
It's similar to the way we approach transgender identity,
right.
where self-identification is generally accepted.
The https.wholearchive.org archive 2 video source actually dives into this comparison,
Okay.
citing philosophers like Cressida Has and Susan Stryker,
Right.
who argue for the importance of respecting self-identification in
Yeah.
both transgender and transracial contexts.
That's interesting. But on the flip side, there are concerns about cultural appropriation,
Right.
potential harm to marginalized groups,
Yes.
and even the possibility of deception.
Right. The RCTA, understanding RCTA's source, delves into these concerns,
Okay.
emphasizing the importance of approaching another culture with genuine respect and understanding.
Uh-huh.
It warns against simply adopting elements of a culture without acknowledging the history and lived realities of that group.
Yeah. It can feel like cherry picking.
Yeah.
Like someone is just taking the aspects of a culture they find appealing without recognizing the struggles and complexities that come with being part of that group.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of passing as a different race.
Right.
Historically, people have done this for a variety of reasons,
Okay.
often to escape discrimination or gain access to opportunities that were denied to them because of their race.
You mentioned passing. Can you explain a bit more about what that means?
Sure.
And why it might be considered ethically problematic?
Passing essentially means presenting yourself as a member of a racial group that you're not biologically a part of. And the ethical concerns arise
Yeah.
because it often involves a degree of deception.
Uh-huh.
The transracialism, is it possible to change one's race? Video highlights this point.
It makes you think about authenticity.
Right.
If someone is passing as a different race, are they truly being themselves?
Yeah.
Or are they potentially reinforcing harmful stereotypes
Yeah.
and perpetuating a system that judges people based on appearances?
Those are really important questions to consider.
Yeah.
And it's also crucial to acknowledge the historical context and power dynamics at play.
Right.
For centuries, minorities have had to navigate a world designed by and for the majority,
Mhm.
often facing systemic biases and having to fight for their rights.
That brings us back to the idea of the minority effect.
Yes.
How even small groups can challenge the status quo and create meaningful change.
Precisely. The minority effect reminds us that progress doesn't always come from those in positions of power.
Right.
Change often originates from the margins, from the voices and actions of those who have been historically marginalized or excluded.
Think about pivotal moments in history like the civil rights movement,
Right.
the fight for LGBTQ+ rights, or the ongoing struggle for racial justice.
Oh.
These were all movements led by minority groups
Yeah.
who challenged the existing power structures and pushed for greater equality.
And these movements faced immense opposition.
Yeah.
The Great Replacement Theory Explained video, for example, shows how fear and prejudice can be used to stoke anxieties
Right.
about one group's culture being replaced by another.
Yeah.
And in the, quote, Goats podcast, episode 16,
Okay.
we see how someone like Martina Big, a white woman who underwent procedures to appear black, can spark controversy and raise ethical concern
Right.
when they express desires like wanting a black baby solely based on appearance.
It's clear that any conversation about transracialism needs to be mindful of these power dynamics and historical contexts.
Absolutely.
We're talking about challenging deeply ingrained beliefs and societal structures.
Yeah.
It's not just about individual choices.
Right.
It's about the broader implications for marginalized communities.
Absolutely. And it forces us to ask some really tough questions.
Okay.
If race is a social construct,
Uh-huh.
does that make transracial identification automatically invalid?
Right.
Or could it actually open up possibilities for more fluid and self-determined understandings of race in the future?
Wow, these are heavy questions.
They are.
And it seems like there are valid points on all sides of this debate.
There are, and that's what makes this conversation so compelling.
Yeah.
It challenges us to confront our own assumptions and biases and to think critically about how we define and understand race and identity in a world that's constantly evolving.
It's definitely a lot to process, but it's such an important discussion to have.
Yes.
So, to our listeners out there, what stands out to you most from our conversation so far?
Right.
What questions are you grappling with? Join us for part 3 as we explore the complexities of transracialism even further and try to make sense of this fascinating and often controversial topic. We'll come back to the final part of our deep dive into transracialism and the minority effect. It's been a journey, hasn't it?
It has.
We've gone from definitions
Right.
to history
Uh-huh.
to the very personal experiences of transracial individuals.
Right.
But now, let's try to bring it all together.
Yeah, it's time to tackle the big so what?
Right.
What can we learn from all of this?
Yeah.
And how can we apply it to the way we think about race and identity in the world around us?
Exactly. We've explored some really strong
Yeah.
and often conflicting viewpoints.
Uh-huh.
Like, where do we land? How do we make sense of it all?
Well, I think one of the key takeaways from our exploration of the minority effect is the idea that real change,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to challenging deeply ingrained social norms and power structures, often comes from the margins.
It's like those small groups, those
Uh-huh.
minorities act as a catalyst for change.
Yeah.
They introduce new ideas and perspectives that can shake things up
Right.
and force the majority to reconsider their assumptions.
And transracialism, in a way, embodies this dynamic.
Okay.
It's a concept that challenges our traditional understanding of race and belonging.
Right.
Whether people agree with it or not,
Uh-huh.
it forces us to confront those long-held beliefs about race and identity.
We see this happening in online spaces like the RCTA Safe Community,
Okay.
where individuals are using the internet to connect with others who share their experiences and to explore their transracial identities.
These online communities are creating spaces for dialogue and support,
Yeah.
and in doing so, they're pushing the boundaries of what's considered normal when it comes to racial identification.
It's a reminder that society is constantly evolving.
Right.
And our understanding of concepts like race and gender are always shifting.
Yeah.
The let's all get past this confusion about trans people. Video makes a similar point, that our views on identity are fluid and subject to change over time.
And that evolution is often driven by the voices and actions of those who don't fit neatly into the existing categories,
Right.
those who challenge the status quo and demand recognition and inclusion.
So back to that central question.
Yeah.
Can you really change your race?
Right.
We've heard arguments that prioritize self-identification
Uh-huh.
and the importance of personal experience.
Right.
But we've also acknowledged the concerns about cultural appropriation,
Yeah.
the potential for harm,
Uh-huh.
and the complex interplay between biology and social factors.
It's a lot to weigh.
Yeah.
And I think the most important takeaway from this whole deep dive
Yeah.
is that there's no easy answer.
Right.
Transracialism is a nuanced issue,
Oh.
and it requires thoughtful engagement,
Yeah.
not knee-jerk reactions or simplistic solutions.
It challenges us to really examine our own beliefs about race and identity,
Right.
and to engage in respectful dialogue with those who hold different viewpoints.
And as we move forward in an increasingly interconnected world,
Yeah.
these conversations are only going to become more important.
So to our listeners,
Yeah.
we leave you with this final thought.
Okay.
If race is indeed largely a social construct, as science suggests,
Right.
what does that mean for the future?
Yeah, good question.
Could we see a world where racial categories become more fluid
Right.
and where self-identification is valued above all else?
And how can we ensure that this evolution happens in a way that is respectful,
Right.
inclusive, and mindful of the historical context and power dynamics that continue to shape our understanding of race?
These are big questions,
They are.
and there are no easy answers.
Right.
But by continuing to learn, to question,
Yeah.
and to engage in thoughtful dialogue,
Uh-huh.
we can move toward a deeper understanding of ourselves, each other, and the complex world we live in.
Until our next deep dive, keep those minds open and keep exploring.